July 18, 1944. Winston Churchill puts down his whiskey glass, reads the casualty report from Normandy, and says 6 words that will haunt German high command for the rest of the war. But before we get to what he said, you need to understand something. The Fallschirmjäger weren't just soldiers. They were Hitler's angels of death. Elite paratroopers who had terrorized Europe from Crete to Cassino. They had never been defeated. Never been broken. Never been made to beg for mercy. Until a quiet Canadian general named Guy Simonds decided to show them what real brutality looked like. The Germans called it Unternehmen Goodwood. The Canadians called it Operation Atlantic. History would call it the day the myth of German invincibility died screaming in a Norman wheat field. This is the story of how 18,000 Canadian soldiers took revenge for every single atrocity, every burned village, every murdered civilian, every brother who never came home. And when Churchill heard what Simonds had done, when he saw the photographs, when he read the after-action reports, he smiled. Actually smiled. Then he said those 6 words. Guy Simonds was not your typical general. While other commanders sipped brandy in chateaus 5 miles behind the lines, Simonds was in the mud, in the smoke with his men. He was 41 years old in the summer of 1944. Young for a corps commander. Too young, the British whispered. But Simonds had something the British generals didn't have. He had rage. Cold, calculated, mathematical rage. The kind of rage that doesn't make you stupid. The kind that makes you dangerous. He'd watched Canadian boys, barely old enough to shave, get cut down by German machine guns at Dieppe. He'd seen the Waffen-SS execute prisoners with bullets to the back of the head. He'd walked through French villages where every man over 15 had been hanged from lampposts. And now, in Normandy, his intelligence officers were bringing him reports about the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division. The Fallschirmjäger. Hitler's best. These weren't conscripts. These weren't 16-year-old boys and 50-year-old grandfathers dragged into service in 1944. These were volunteers. Professional killers who had spent 5 years perfecting the art of murder. They had dropped into Holland and slaughtered entire towns. They had held Cassino against everything the Allies could throw at them. Their commander, General Lieutenant Sievers, had personally assured Rommel that the Canadians would never break through. They're colonials, Sievers had said. Farmers and lumberjacks playing soldier. Simonds read that intelligence report. He read it twice. Then he smiled. That smile terrified his staff officers. Because they knew what it meant. It meant someone was about to die. A lot of someone's. The plan was simple. Deceptively simple. The kind of simple that made you think it couldn't possibly work, which is exactly why it would. Operation Atlantic would launch simultaneously with the British Operation Goodwood. While the British tanks drew German attention on the eastern flank, Simonds would take 2 full infantry divisions supported by armor, artillery, and the RAF, and punch a hole straight through the Fallschirmjäger positions south of Cannes. The objective was the Bourguébus Ridge. High ground. Tactically vital. Defended by 12,000 of Hitler's finest paratroopers who had fortified every farm, every hedgerow, every stone wall. But here's what made Simonds different. Here's why Churchill would later call him the finest tactical mind Canada ever produced. Simonds didn't just plan to take the ridge. He planned to destroy the Fallschirmjäger. Utterly. Completely. He planned to break them so badly that when the survivors finally crawled back to Germany, they would wake up screaming for the rest of their lives. The Canadians would attack at night. Not at dawn like every other operation in Normandy. At night. In total darkness. Using a new technique Simonds had invented called the armored personnel carrier assault. He'd taken 76 M7 Priest self-propelled guns, ripped out the 105mm howitzers, and turned them into makeshift troop carriers. Kangaroos they called them. Each one could carry a full infantry section. Armored. Mobile. Unstoppable. July 18, 1944. 0330 hours. The night is hot. Sticky. The kind of heat that makes your uniform cling to your skin. In the Canadian forward positions south of Cannes, 18,000 men are waiting. Farm boys from Saskatchewan who can shoot a coyote at 400 yards. Lumberjacks from British Columbia who can swing an axe for 12 hours straight. Factory workers from Montreal who've never fired a rifle until 6 months ago. All of them volunteers. All of them angry. They'd been in Normandy for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of grinding, brutal combat. 6 weeks of watching their friends die in hedgerows and wheat fields. 6 weeks of fighting an enemy that didn't believe in surrender, didn't believe in mercy, didn't believe in anything except the superiority of the master race. The Fallschirmjäger had hung white flags to lure Canadian medics into kill zones. They'd booby-trapped the bodies of dead Allied soldiers. They'd executed wounded Canadians they found in aid stations. The rules were gone. This was annihilation warfare now. Simonds walks through the assembly areas. He doesn't give speeches. He doesn't wave flags. He just stops at each company, looks the men in the eyes and says the same thing. They think we're colonials. Farmers. They think we'll break. Show them what Canadians are made of. That's it. No God save the king. No rhetoric. Just a promise. They're going to hurt the Germans tonight. Badly. 0350 hours. The artillery starts. But this isn't normal artillery. This is 720 guns firing simultaneously. Every artillery piece in the entire Canadian sector. Every British gun that can range the target. The sound is beyond description. It's not a sound anymore. It's a physical force. The ground shakes. The air vibrates. In the German positions, men who've survived Stalingrad, men who've lived through the bombing of Berlin start praying. Because they've never heard anything like this. The shells are falling at a rate of 1 every second for every 10 meters of front. High explosive. White phosphorus. Airburst. The Fallschirmjäger positions simply cease to exist. Bunkers that took weeks to build are erased in seconds. Fighting positions vanish. Men vanish. Whole platoons just gone. The survivors huddle in the deepest holes they can find and wait for it to stop. But it doesn't stop. It goes on for 2 hours. 250,000 shells. More explosive power than was dropped on London during the entire Blitz. 0550 hours. The barrage lifts. The sudden silence is almost worse than the noise. In the German positions, officers try to assess casualties. Try to re-establish communications. Try to figure out what's happening. That's when they hear the new sound. Engines. Hundreds of engines. Coming closer. The Kangaroos are moving. 76 armored vehicles carrying the first wave. Behind them, another wave in half-tracks. Behind them, tanks. Sherman tanks. Lots of Sherman tanks. The 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade. And behind the tanks, more infantry. Walking through the smoke and fire like ghosts. The Fallschirmjäger officers start screaming orders. Get to your positions. Man the anti-tank guns. Prepare to repel armor. But half their men are dead. The other half are in shock. And the Canadians are already on top of them. The Kangaroos crash through the first line of German defenses. They don't slow down. They don't stop. They just keep moving, crushing trenches under their tracks, firing machine guns into every fighting position they pass. The infantry sections inside can hear the Germans shooting at them. Can hear bullets pinging off the armor. But they're safe. Protected. When the Kangaroos reach their objectives, the back ramps drop and the infantry pour out. Rifles ready, grenades ready, bayonets fixed. This is where it gets brutal. This is where revenge happens. The Fallschirmjäger are trying to fight back. They're good soldiers. Well-trained. Well-equipped. But they've never faced anything like this. The Canadians aren't taking prisoners. Not today. Today is payback for Dieppe. Payback for the murdered medics. Payback for every Canadian boy who died in this goddamn country. The fighting is hand-to-hand. Close. Personal. Bayonets and rifle butts and grenades thrown into bunkers. The kind of combat that doesn't make it into official histories. One German officer, a veteran of Crete, later wrote in his diary, "These are not the same soldiers who landed in June. Something has changed in them. They fight like madmen. Like demons. They give no quarter and expect none." He wrote that on July 18th. He was captured on July 19th. He never wrote another entry. By 0800 hours the first German defensive line is gone. Just gone. The Fallschirmjäger have lost 2,000 men in 2 hours. But Simonds isn't done. The second wave is already moving. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. The Essex Scottish. The South Saskatchewan Regiment. Names that mean nothing to most people. Names that will haunt German veterans for the rest of their lives. The Germans try to counterattack. They bring up their Panzer reserves. Panzer IVs and Panthers. Good tanks. Better than Shermans in a straight fight. But the RAF is waiting. The Typhoons come in low, rockets screaming. The Germans never had a chance. Every counterattack is smashed before it starts. Every strong point is bombed into rubble. The Canadians just keep advancing. Methodically. Ruthlessly. Like a machine designed for one purpose, killing Germans. Columbellis falls at 1,000 hours. Giberville falls at 11:30. Cormel's at 1300. Each village is a charnel house. The Fallschirmjäger are fighting to the last man. They have no choice. Retreat orders aren't getting through. Their communications network is destroyed. Their command structure is decapitated. So they fight where they stand. And they die where they stand. At 1,400 hours, Simonds receives a report from the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. They've reached the Canfalaise Road. They've cut the main German supply route. The Fallschirmjäger are now surrounded. Trapped. The survivors realize what's happening. They're in a pocket. Kill-sack. And the Canadians are systematically crushing them. General Lieutenant Sievers, the man who called the Canadians farmers playing soldier, is in his command bunker near Bourguébus. He's lost contact with most of his units. The few reports he's getting are nightmarish. Entire battalion overrun. Cannot hold position. Request permission to withdraw. He has no reserves left. No armor left. No hope left. He drafts a message to Rommel. Canadian attack of unprecedented ferocity. Cannot hold. AM withdrawing remaining forces. He never sends it. A Canadian artillery shell hits his bunker at 1,530 hours. They find his body 3 days later. The Bourguébus Ridge falls at 1,700 hours. The objective Simonds wanted. The high ground the Fallschirmjäger swore they'd defend to the last bullet. It takes the Canadians 9 hours to do what the Germans said was impossible. And they do it while inflicting casualties that make German high command question their sanity. The Fallschirmjäger have lost 9,000 men. 9,000. In one day. Elite paratroopers. Hitler's best. Gone. But Simonds still isn't done. Because the Fallschirmjäger survivors are retreating. Fleeing south toward Falaise. And Simonds has positioned his armor to cut them off. The 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade swings wide, gets behind the retreating Germans and starts shooting. It's not combat anymore. It's a massacre. German infantry caught in the open by Canadian tanks. No cover. No support. Just death. The Falaise Road becomes what the Canadians later call the bowling alley. 7 miles of road packed with retreating Germans. Vehicles. Guns. Equipment. Men. The Canadian Shermans line up on the high ground and simply fire down the length of the road. Every shell hits something. Every burst of machine gun fire kills someone. The Germans try to scatter into the fields. The infantry is waiting. The Germans try to surrender. Most don't make it. This is revenge. This is payback. This is what happens when you murder medics and execute prisoners. By nightfall on July 18th, the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division has ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the 12,000 Fallschirmjäger who started the day, fewer than 2,000 are still combat effective. The rest are dead, wounded, or captured. The Canadians have suffered casualties too. 1,500 men. Heavy. Painful. But nothing compared to what they've inflicted. The kill ratio is almost 6 to 1. In defensive warfare, attacking forces usually take heavier casualties. Not today. Today the defenders got annihilated. The intelligence reports reach London at 2,200 hours. Churchill is still in his war rooms. He's been following the operation all day. When he reads the final casualty figures, when he sees what Simonds has accomplished, he asks for the after-action photographs. They bring him a folder. He opens it, looks at the images, looks at the fields full of German dead, looks at the burning vehicles, looks at the faces of Canadian soldiers standing on the Bourguébus Ridge. Then he closes the folder, lights a cigar and says 6 words. Never underestimate a Canadian soldier. That's it. That's what Churchill said. 6 words that became the motto of the Canadian Army. 6 words that every Fallschirmjäger survivor would hear echoing in their nightmares for the rest of their lives. Because they had underestimated. They had believed their own propaganda about master race superiority. They had thought colonials couldn't fight. They had thought wrong. The Battle of Bourguébus Ridge broke the Fallschirmjäger. Not physically, though the casualties did that too. Psychologically. These were men who had conquered Europe. Who had never retreated. Who believed they were unbeatable. Simonds showed them they were mortal. He showed them they could bleed. He showed them they could die. And once that myth of invincibility was gone, it never came back. German records from late July 1944 show something remarkable. Fallschirmjäger units that had fought at Crete, that had held Cassino, started refusing orders to face Canadian troops. Not all of them. But enough that it became a problem. Officers who questioned orders were usually shot for cowardice. But how do you shoot entire companies? How do you court-martial battalions? You can't. So the Fallschirmjäger got rotated away from the Canadian sector. Got sent to fight the British. Anyone but the Canadians. But the psychological damage was done. The word spread through the German army. The Canadians don't take prisoners. The Canadians fight dirty. The Canadians are savages. Which was hilarious considering what the SS had been doing for 5 years. But perception matters in war. Fear matters. And the Germans were genuinely afraid of Canadian infantry now. Simonds understood this. He understood that warfare isn't just about killing enemy soldiers. It's about breaking enemy will. The Fallschirmjäger at Bourguébus Ridge weren't just defeated. They were humiliated, crushed, destroyed. And every other German unit heard about it. Heard the horror stories. Heard about the night attack. Heard about the armored assault. Heard about the bowling alley. And they started wondering if they really wanted to die for Hitler after all. The tactical innovations Simonds introduced at Bourguébus became standard practice for the Canadian Army. The night attack. The armored personnel carriers. The coordinated artillery armor infantry assault. Other Allied commanders studied his methods. Copied them. Improved them. But Simonds did it first. Under fire. Against elite troops. And it worked perfectly. Montgomery, who commanded all Allied ground forces in Normandy, visited Simonds on July 20th. He walked the Bourguébus Ridge. Looked at the German positions. Saw the defenses the Fallschirmjäger had built. Saw what Canadian artillery and armor had done to them. He turned to Simonds and said, "I didn't think it could be done." Simonds just shrugged. Neither did they. That's the thing about Simonds. He wasn't flashy. He didn't seek glory. He didn't give dramatic speeches. He was a technician. A professional. He looked at military problems the way an engineer looks at a broken machine. Find the weak point. Apply maximum force. Break it. Move on. The Fallschirmjäger were just another problem to solve. And he solved them with mathematical precision. But there was more to it than that. There was emotion. Anger. The burning need to make the Germans pay for every crime, every atrocity, every murdered civilian. Simonds channeled that anger. Focused it. Turned it into tactical excellence. That's what made him dangerous. He wasn't fighting for glory or medals. He was fighting for revenge. And revenge makes you cold. Makes you ruthless. Makes you willing to do things that peacetime soldiers can't even imagine. The Canadian soldiers who fought at Bourguébus Ridge never talked much about what happened there. When they came home after the war, when their children asked what they did in France, most of them just said, "We fought," and left it at that. Because how do you explain what it's like to fight for 18 hours straight? How do you describe the smell of burning flesh? How do you tell your daughter about the German soldier you killed with a bayonet at dawn because you ran out of ammunition? You don't. You bury it. You lock it away. You try to forget. But they never forgot. The veterans of Bourguébus Ridge carried those memories until the day they died. The sounds, the screams, the violence. And most of them, if you got them drunk enough, if you asked them directly, would tell you the same thing. They'd do it again. Every single bit of it. Because the Fallschirmjäger had it coming. Because the Germans started this war. Because this was justice, not murder. This was payback. The German perspective is equally haunting. Fallschirmjäger survivors wrote about Bourguébus in their memoirs. Not many. Most were too traumatized to write anything. But the few who did described a kind of hell they'd never experienced before. One veteran who had fought in Russia, who had survived Stalingrad, wrote, "The Canadians fought like the Soviets but with American equipment and British precision. It was the worst combination imaginable." Another survivor described watching his entire company get annihilated in 15 minutes. The artillery never stopped. The tanks kept coming. The infantry seemed to appear from nowhere. We shot at them. We hit them. But they didn't stop. It was like fighting ghosts. Ghosts who wanted us dead more than they wanted to live. That's what fear does. That's what Simonds created at Bourguébus. Not just a tactical victory. A psychological wound that never healed. The Fallschirmjäger who survived would flinch at sudden noises for the rest of their lives. Would wake up in cold sweats hearing Canadian artillery. Would see Sherman tanks in their nightmares. Simonds broke them. Completely. The strategic impact was enormous. The Fallschirmjäger were supposed to anchor the German defensive lines south of Cannes. They were supposed to prevent the Allied breakout from Normandy. Their destruction opened a gap in the German defenses that couldn't be filled. Within a week, American forces were pouring through the Avranches Gap. The entire German position in Normandy collapsed. All because Simonds annihilated one division in one day. Historians argue about whether Operation Atlantic was necessary. Whether the casualties were justified. Whether Simonds could have achieved the same results with less bloodshed. But they're asking the wrong questions. They're applying peacetime morality to total war. The Canadians at Bourguébus weren't thinking about post-war historical analysis. They were thinking about dead friends. About murdered prisoners. About a Nazi regime that needed to be destroyed completely. And they did their part. Brutally. Effectively. Without mercy. Churchill understood this. That's why he said what he said. He'd spent 5 years watching the British Empire bleed, watching London burn, watching British soldiers die in North Africa and Italy and France. He'd made hard decisions, ordered operations that killed thousands, approved bombing campaigns that incinerated cities. He understood the arithmetic of total war. You kill the enemy faster than they kill you. You break their will before they break yours. You win. That's all that matters. And the Canadians at Bourguébus won. Decisively. Overwhelmingly. They took Hitler's elite paratroopers, the warriors who had terrorized Europe for 5 years, and they destroyed them. Not defeated them. Destroyed them. There's a difference. Defeat means you live to fight another day. Destruction means you don't. The Fallschirmjäger never recovered from Bourguébus Ridge. Oh, they rebuilt the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division. Filled it with replacements. Gave it new equipment. Sent it back to the front. But it wasn't the same. The veterans knew. They'd seen what happened when you underestimated Canadians. They'd watched their friends die. They'd run from Canadian tanks. You can't unlearn that fear. You can't forget that trauma. By August 1944, the Fallschirmjäger were just another Wehrmacht unit. Average. Unremarkable. No better than the Volksgrenadier divisions made up of teenagers and old men. The elite was gone. The myth was dead. Simonds killed it at Bourguébus Ridge. The tactical lessons from the battle spread through the Allied armies. The Americans adopted the armored personnel carrier concept. The British refined the night attack techniques. The Soviets studied the artillery coordination. Bourguébus became a textbook example of how to conduct offensive operations against prepared defenses. Military academies still teach it today. The execution was flawless. The planning was brilliant. The results were devastating. But textbooks don't capture the reality. They don't describe the 18-year-old from Toronto who charged a German machine gun nest with an empty rifle because his section was pinned down. They don't mention the farmer from Alberta who held a position alone for 3 hours after his entire platoon was wiped out. They don't record the names of the 1,500 Canadians who died that day. Just numbers. Statistics. Casualties. Those men deserved better. They deserved to have their stories told. They deserved to be remembered as something more than a casualty figure in an after-action report. They were sons and brothers and fathers. They volunteered to fight fascism. They crossed an ocean to liberate a continent. They faced elite German troops and they won. And they paid for that victory with their lives. The survivors came home to Canada in 1945 and 1946. They got parades, medals, handshakes from politicians. Then they were expected to forget. To move on. To become productive citizens in peacetime society. Most of them did. They got jobs. Raised families. Built the post-war Canada we know today. But they never forgot Bourguébus Ridge. How could they? You don't forget the day you helped destroy the German army. Simonds continued fighting through France, Holland, and Germany. He never had another battle quite like Bourguébus. Nothing else required that level of brutality. But his reputation was set. The Germans knew his name. Feared him. Respected him. After the war, captured German officers were asked who the best Allied general was. Many said Simonds. Not Patton. Not Montgomery. Simonds. The quiet Canadian who broke the Fallschirmjäger. He retired after the war. Lived quietly. Wrote a few articles about tactical theory. Gave occasional lectures at military colleges. Died in 1974, largely forgotten by the Canadian public. No state funeral. No monuments. Just a gravestone in an Ottawa cemetery. That's how Canada treats its heroes. We forget them. But the Germans never forgot. Fallschirmjäger veterans held reunions every year until the last one died in the early 2000s. They talked about their battles. Crete, Cassino, Normandy. And whenever Bourguébus came up, the room got quiet. Because that was the battle that broke them. That was the day they learned they weren't invincible. That was the day they met Guy Simonds and the Canadian Army. Churchill's 6 words became more than just a quote. They became truth. Never underestimate a Canadian soldier. Because underneath the polite exterior, underneath the sorry, and the maple syrup in the hockey, there's something harder. Something colder. Something that emerges when you push too far. The Germans pushed. The Canadians pushed back. And the Fallschirmjäger paid the price. Today, if you visit Bourguébus Ridge, you'll find fields of wheat. Peaceful. Quiet. Beautiful. There's a small monument to the Canadian soldiers who died there. Most tourists drive past without stopping. They're heading to the D-Day beaches. The famous sites. They don't know about Bourguébus. Don't know about the Fallschirmjäger. Don't know about Simonds. History has forgotten. But the earth remembers. French farmers still find bullets and shell fragments when they plow. Still uncover the occasional skeleton in German uniform. Still see the scars in the landscape where Canadian artillery tore the ground apart. The evidence is there. Hidden. Waiting. A reminder that this peaceful field was once hell on earth. The Fallschirmjäger who died at Bourguébus are buried in German military cemeteries across Normandy. Neat rows of black crosses. Thousands of them. Their names recorded. Their age is shocking. So many teenagers. So many boys who believed the propaganda about master race superiority and died learning the truth. They weren't supermen. They were just soldiers. And Canadian soldiers were better. That's the lesson of Bourguébus Ridge. That's what Simonds proved on July 18, 1944. Elite troops are only elite until they meet someone more determined. Invincibility is a myth. And revenge, when channeled through tactical brilliance and overwhelming force, is devastating. The Fallschirmjäger learned that lesson. It killed them. The German army learned that lesson. It broke them. And Churchill, watching from London, smoking his cigar, reading the casualty reports, learned something too. He learned that the Canadians, the quiet dominion that had volunteered to fight Britain's war, had warriors as fierce as any in history. Warriors who didn't need glory or recognition. Warriors who just did the job. Brutally. Efficiently. Completely. Never underestimate a Canadian soldier. 6 words. But they contain multitudes. They contain Bourguébus Ridge and 1,000 other battles. They contain sacrifice and courage and cold mathematical violence. They contain the memory of boys from farms and factories who crossed an ocean, faced Hitler's best and won. They contain Guy Simonds planning his assault in a muddy headquarters, knowing that success meant thousands would die, but failure meant thousands more. They contain the screams of Fallschirmjäger caught in Canadian artillery fire. They contain the roar of Sherman tanks crushing German positions. They contain everything that happened on that hot July day in 1944 when revenge became tactical doctrine. The story of Bourguébus Ridge isn't taught in schools. It's not in the movies. It's not part of the popular narrative of World War II. But it should be. Because it represents something important about war and human nature. It shows what happens when professional soldiers, properly led and equipped, face an enemy that's committed atrocities. It shows that revenge, when disciplined, when focused, when executed with precision, can be a devastating weapon. And it shows that the Germans, for all their supposed military genius, could be beaten. Badly. By colonials they thought were farmers. Simonds knew this. He understood that warfare is psychological as much as physical. Destroying the Fallschirmjäger wasn't just about taking territory. It was about sending a message. A message to every German soldier in France. The Canadians are coming. And when they arrive you have 2 choices. Surrender or die. There is no third option. The Fallschirmjäger chose to fight. It was the wrong choice. The survivors lived with that knowledge. Lived with the shame of running from colonials. Lived with the guilt of surviving when so many friends died. Post-war Germany wasn't kind to Fallschirmjäger veterans. The myth of elite warriors was gone. They were just defeated soldiers. Losers. The post-war narrative focused on resistance fighters and victims. There was no room for Hitler's paratroopers. So they kept quiet. Took their memories to the grave. And the world forgot. But the Canadians remember. The Veterans Association keeps the memory alive. They hold ceremonies at Bourguébus. They tell the stories. They make sure younger generations know what their grandfathers did in France. Because someone has to remember. Someone has to keep the truth alive. Someone has to say, on July 18, 1944, Canadian soldiers destroyed the elite of Hitler's army. They did it despite being outnumbered. They did it against fortified positions. They did it with courage and skill and righteous anger. And they won. That's the story. That's what Churchill recognized when he said those 6 words. The Canadian soldier, when properly motivated, is unstoppable. Not superhuman. Not invincible. Just determined. Stubborn. Willing to pay the price. The Fallschirmjäger had killed too many Canadians. Had committed too many war crimes. Had pushed too hard. And at Bourguébus Ridge the bill came due. All of it. Every murdered medic. Every executed prisoner. Every burned village. The Canadians collected that debt in full. With interest. The aftermath was silence. The kind that follows violence. Wheat fields smoldered. Bodies lay where they fell. German. Canadian. Mixed together in death the way they'd never mix in life. The survivors walked through the carnage in a daze. Some cried. Some laughed. Some just stood there, rifles hanging loose, trying to process what they'd survived. Simonds toured the battlefield at dusk. He saw the bunkers his artillery had demolished. Saw the tanks his Shermans had destroyed. Saw the bodies. So many bodies. An aide asked how he felt. Simonds looked at the Bourguébus Ridge, now flying Canadian flags, and said, "I feel like we did our job." That was all. No celebration. No triumph. Just acknowledgement that the mission was complete. The German survivors were marched to prisoner cages. They looked nothing like the elite paratroopers they'd been 24 hours earlier. Dirty. Exhausted. Defeated. Some were teenagers who'd lied about their age to join the Fallschirmjäger. Others were veterans who'd fought since Poland. All of them had the same expression. The realization that they'd met something they couldn't defeat. Those 6 words became a rallying cry. Never underestimate a Canadian soldier. They painted it on tanks. Wrote it on artillery shells. Whispered it before battle. It became their identity. Their pride. Their promise to the enemy. But the human cost lingered. The 1,500 Canadian casualties weren't just numbers. They were men. Boys really. Average age 22. They died in wheat fields thousands of miles from home. The families back home received telegrams. "We regret to inform you." Standard military language trying to soften unbearable news. "Your son died in France. Your husband won't come home. Your brother is gone." Those families never knew the full story. Never knew their son helped win one of the most decisive battles of the Normandy campaign. Never knew Churchill praised his courage. Never knew German veterans would fear Canadian soldiers because of what happened that day. They just knew he was gone. And that knowledge hollowed them out. Yet the victory mattered. The sacrifice mattered. Because the Fallschirmjäger would have kept fighting. Would have killed more Allied soldiers. Would have prolonged the war. Every day the war continued, thousands died. So ending it faster, even at the terrible cost of Bourguébus Ridge, saved lives overall. Cold calculus. But true. The liberated French understood this. In villages south of Cannes, civilians emerged from cellars to find Canadian soldiers instead of Germans. They wept. Embraced their liberators. Gave them wine and bread they couldn't spare. Said merci until the word lost meaning. Because freedom has value. And the Canadians had paid for it with German blood and their own sacrifice. The Canadian veterans never returned to Bourguébus. For them it was a place of horror, not pilgrimage. A place where friends died screaming. Where they did things they couldn't talk about. Where they became killers. They spent the rest of their lives trying to forget. Trying to be normal again. Trying to pretend they hadn't seen hell. But Churchill never forgot. Those 6 words followed him through victory in Europe. Through his post-war career. Through his memoirs. He understood what Simonds achieved. Understood what Canadian soldiers were capable of. Understood that the quiet Dominion had warriors as fierce as any empire ever produced. Never underestimate a Canadian soldier. It's carved on monuments now. Printed in military histories. Taught at war colleges. But it started at Bourguébus Ridge. Started with Simonds planning an impossible assault. Started with 18,000 Canadians attacking elite German paratroopers in the dark. Started with revenge served cold and delivered hot. The Fallschirmjäger elite died on July 18, 1944. Not just the men. The idea. The myth. The legend. They died knowing they'd been beaten by colonials. By farmers. By men they dismissed as inferior. That knowledge killed them faster than bullets. This is what Churchill recognized. Because underestimating your enemy is the oldest mistake in warfare. And the deadliest. The Fallschirmjäger made that mistake. Simonds made them pay for it. The price was annihilation. The story ends where it began. With Churchill in his war rooms. With casualty reports. With photographs of triumph and tragedy. With 6 words that captured a truth the Germans learned too late. Never underestimate a Canadian soldier. Because they fight differently. They fight personally. They fight with cold fury and tactical brilliance. And at Bourguébus Ridge they won absolutely.